Professor Haar, Professor Issing, ladies and gentlemen, but especially Jens, President Weidmann, thank you very much for this invitation to this prestigious university. As Jens Weidmann reminded us just a minute ago, I spent most of my time at the university and I really enjoyed it a lot. And I'm looking forward to going back there, who knows when. I'm also humbled and really flattered for the undeserving and undeserved words that align my career to that of a great man such as Wolfgang Goethe. Indeed, I did not know about his experience as finance minister, and I should perhaps go back and look at what he has done. Maybe I can get some good economic advice in addition to cultural advice. The title of my talk is Promoting Growth, Employment and Solidarity in Europe After the British Referendum. Let me assure you that by no means I did not want to mention or think about solidity and sustainability. Let's agree on the words, but the concept is the same. So let me, just to give you the flavor, let me give you the key points of my speech. First of all, I will start from the fact that we are now in a world of increased policy uncertainty. And against the backdrop of a heightened uncertainty, we need a coordinated strategy in Europe to preserve the sustainability of the European project. The outcome of the British referendum has further certified how much the European Union is struggling. To underpin the EU project, it is crucial to rebuild trust and confidence, regaining growth and creating good quality employment. To this effect, we have to use both our common and our national toolboxes to boost public and private investment, implement a more balanced fiscal stance, achieve an effective interaction between structural reforms and EU reinforced action. We also have to reinforce our common tools and institutions to manage what I would like to call European public goods and face new challenges such as migration. But let me start from political uncertainty. Despite the collective effort at the EU and global level towards strong, sustainable and balanced growth, economic prospects remain weak and unequally distributed, with significant downside risks. The latest updates to the outlook delivered by the international organizations have once more reviewed growth projections downward. After the deep recession in 2008 and 2009, we would have expected an acceleration of growth, putting the world economy quickly back to peak levels of GDP and inflation. This did not happen. Certainly it did not happen in Europe, leaving the recovery significantly below expectations that were modeled on past experience. So we are in a new scenario. In a nutshell, such a scenario could be described as the result of rising preference for savings, accompanied by decreasing propensity to invest. This combination hampers growth, reduces real interest rates, and compresses inflation. In such a context, markets expect that interest and inflation rates, as well as growth, will stay low for long. And markets have embedded in their expectations what we now should call or could call a new normal. While high savings can be justified by higher risk aversion, low investment can be explained, and has been explained by many analyses, including by international organizations, at the same time by weak demand and high policy uncertainty. And I would like to concentrate on this second element. Heightened policy uncertainty should not be related specifically to election results. After all, we have been having elections for a long time, and this is not necessarily associated with policy uncertainty. What is the new element in the scenario is that now, more than in the past, policy outcomes, election outcomes, or referendum outcomes could lead to policy results that are seen as able to trigger systemic impacts. And indeed, this has been the case of the British referendum. This implies that as election or referendum approach, there is a wait-and-see attitude by households and business that is prevailing. This holds back investment and consumption decisions while it increases precautionary savings. In addition, in an environment of uncertainty, frequent and significant shocks to aggregate demand, if not properly addressed, can produce persistent damages to the economy to the so-called hysteresis effects. After a negative shock or recurring bad news, firms can choose to postpone their investment plans, for instance in research and innovation, cut the turnover, and eventually shut down factories and productive sites. If prolonged, a recession implies an increase of long-term unemployed who tend to lose their skills and separate from the labor market, deteriorating the match between demand and supply and increasing segmentation. At the aggregate level, these effects can have long-lasting impacts on the future productive capacity of the economy. Potential output will go down and stay down. In addition, for workers, being out of work depresses confidence and exacerbates exclusion and inequality. In such a context, to dissipate uncertainty, policy action is more crucial than ever. Policy action must support demand and supply factors in a coherent long-term framework in order to amplify the benefits of structural reform and investment. All available policy tools must be activated in a coordinated fashion, as the now broadly accepted policy paradigm, including at the G20, reminds us. So monetary policy must be accommodative. Fiscal policy should be supportive where fiscal space is available, while structural reforms should clear the path to higher growth rates from administrative and regulatory hurdles by liberalizing labor and product markets, making the system more flexible and more reactive to policy stimuli. Along these lines, an effective growth strategy should include reforms aimed at making the institutional framework more predictable and stable, so that policy decisions can be introduced quickly and reinforce long-term expectations and propensity to invest. Evidence shows how significant the negative impact of institutional instability can be on growth. This stems from the uncertainty it generates for consumers and investors, from the lack of policy directions which make an economy more vulnerable to shocks, and from a more conflictual relationship between different levels of government, local and national. Policy uncertainty and low growth prospects are prominent in the European landscape today. The EU is particularly exposed to the risks of prolonged weak growth compared to other regions. As in Europe, population is aging more quickly, innovation is less dynamic, and the financial system is more fragmented, weakening further the transmission mechanism of monetary stimulus. In such a perspective, it is not surprising if, after 8 years of recession, financial crisis and stagnation, the European project is suffering a credibility crisis. This crisis is compounded by the diffuse perception that the policy reaction to the economic downturn and the sizable unemployment is insufficient. EU citizens fail to perceive the value added of being part of the Union and look for different alternatives. A consequence of such a credibility crisis is that national interests tend to prevail over collective ones. Growing signs of dissatisfaction, fed by the exceptional duration and intensity of the crisis, are boosting consensus for populist proposals. Euroscepticism is on the rise in many member states, thus enhancing the impact of policy uncertainty. I believe instead that the European Union is a historic opportunity. We must seize such an opportunity and deliver to our citizens what they expect: less inequality, more jobs, more security. We have gone a long way in our own integration process, including since the breakout of the financial crisis. But now Europe is at a crossroad. If we were to keep muddling through an uncertain recovery, progress in growth and jobs creation would fail to emerge, and both the EU and the euro area would remain exposed to shocks, undermining their sustainability. Importantly, as support for the EU project falters, mutual trust also weakens, making it more difficult to reinforce common institutions. If Europe is to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, we must rebuild trust among our citizens, member states, and European and national institutions, and develop an EU-wide strategy to restore sustained growth, boost jobs, and fight inequality. A virtuous interaction between national policies and EU-coordinated action is the master strategy for the European Union to catch up with higher growth, jobs, and less inequality. Let me offer just a few examples of the strategy, how the strategy should unfold. Of course, this is a very complex task, and as I said, I will just offer a few thoughts about a very complicated issue. As I've already mentioned, against the backdrop of slow and fragile recovery, boosting investment, both public and private, is the top priority to put back the European Union on a path of sustainable growth. Investment supports demand in the short term and strengthens supply and potential output in the medium term. Over the recent past, the fall in investment in the European countries has been widespread. We have to use all our policy measures available at the national and EU level to accelerate a reversal. The Juncker Plan and the European Fund for Strategic Investment were launched by the new Commission with the goal of deploying public leverage to reach out to potentially profitable investment plans whose risk the private sector would not bear on its own. This strategy must be extended and implemented more forcefully, also by targeting the creation of knowledge-based capital, innovation, and infrastructure. We should boost a financing and investment union, where the completion of the banking union, the capital market union, and the Juncker investment plan contribute to a more effective transfer of savings towards investment, including infrastructure investment. The EU governance framework should provide for more incentives for investment in European public goods, including migration and possibly defense. Also at the national level, further common European initiatives should be explored. Projects to enhance EU growth potential could be financed by joint debt issuance. At the national level, to expand investment and support growth, member countries should use the composition of their budget within their fiscal space to target public resources to support investment and competitiveness. In this respect, the newly established European Fiscal Board could take a pan-European view and formulate fiscal policy recommendations for the euro area as a whole. This is key to develop an aggregate policy stance and the EU-wide growth strategy which goes beyond the mere addition of national performance. Symmetry is needed in macroeconomic adjustment. There is room for improvement in the surveillance of macroeconomic policy and structural reforms. Instilling more balance in the way macro surveillance refers to deficit and surplus countries is a key starting point to improve efficiency of the EU surveillance mechanism. Structural reforms in all member states are as relevant as fiscal discipline to build up European Union's economic resilience to external and endogenous shocks and to boost economic convergence. Structural reforms unveil new profit and investment opportunities. The key point is their full implementation. In this respect, the following issues come to mind. First, consensus matters. When designing a plan for structural reform, it is of utmost importance that potential winners and losers are identified beforehand so that measures can be included in the strategy to preserve inclusiveness. Second, structural reforms take time to deploy their effects. In Europe, we know this very well. Germany, for example, has proved to be more resilient than other countries during the financial crisis, also thanks to labor market reforms implemented way back, a few years back. Third, focusing the reform effort only in one area, even an high priority one, might not be sufficient. Some reforms are more groundbreaking than others. However, experience shows that reforms benefits accumulate if a package of reforms is introduced in a coordinated way. To the same extent, benefits of structural reform in any one country would be magnified if other countries also introduce reforms. This calls for coordinated action at national and EU-wide reforms at all levels. But we also have structural reforms at the EU level, and this implies bringing in the single market dimension. In all the measure, the single market remains one of the main drivers of growth, and I am sad to note that the single market non-completed agenda is still large. I have mentioned the finalization of the Capital Markets Union. I would add the creation of a proper energy union and the establishment of an innovation union, a strategy to pool research and knowledge capital, improve spillovers and diffusion of innovation, and deliver a more inclusive economic system. Which brings me to inclusion and inequality, a new dimension in the policy discourse which must gain prominence. Evidence shows that a more inclusive economic system is one with better growth and employment perspectives. Over the last decades, inequality has been increasing in most advanced economies, notwithstanding the belief that higher growth would have been beneficial to all by simply a percolation of the benefits of growth through all segments of society. In fact, the access to economic opportunities is now significantly different at the two extremes of the social ladder, and this produces a loss in terms of productivity and growth prospects, as well, of course, as well-being. On the contrary, evidence shows that a higher inclusion could reinforce growth. So there is a case for measures to support inclusion in the European Union and in the euro area. Again, here measures can be thought in a broad range. Let me, however, spend a few words about a proposal which the Italian government has put forward about adding an explicit employment dimension in the Eurozone, a European scheme against cyclical unemployment. Such a mechanism would enhance citizens' trust in the European Union and in the Eurozone as well, serving as a positive signal of the effectiveness of monetary union by building an important link between monetary and financial convergence and the labor market. Dealing with structural unemployment, of course, requires structural measures, but especially in a monetary union, in the absence of the exchange rate, it is of paramount importance to address the impact of adjustment on employment and wage dynamics, while diminishing the impact of severe shocks on budget balance. In addition, such a scheme would reduce the probability that a cyclical downturn would produce a long-lasting impact on growth potential, smoothing the fluctuations of the economic cycle and generating positive spillovers across the area. The introduction of this system would not imply any treaty change. The instrument would be triggered by severe unemployment shocks, providing a stabilization function. It would build on an appropriate incentive structure in order to limit moral hazard and avoid permanent transfers from some countries to others. No net losers and net winners in the long run. Finally, one key element of the heightened policy uncertainty is the emergence of new challenges. As the 5 Presidents' report has acknowledged, the European countries face common challenges, interests, and responsibilities. This common destiny requires commonly agreed rules and the implementation of common strategies. Migration represents the most urgent issue that Europe has to face today. To help address it, a few months ago, Italy offered the suggestion to implement a European approach to a migration compact. Europe needs to act by deploying an integrated and sustainable initiative addressing both the consequences and the causes of mass migration. The June European Council has taken on board key elements of the Migration Compact by launching the new partnership framework with countries of origin and transit of migration flows. We need now to make the framework operational and effective. Let me just mention a few points that, in my view, are absolutely necessary for the response to the migration issue to be effective. First, integration. Benefits of integrating migrants in national labor markets far outweigh the short-term cost, particularly in an aging society. Properly designed and effective integration policies are of the utmost importance to reap such benefits while coping with the costs. Second, investment in the origin countries to generate decent living conditions and perspectives in addition to security, and therefore jobs and growth in these countries. The external deployment of the Juncker plan should provide a backbone of such a pillar. Third, borders. An effective migration strategy requires a common management of borders, a truly European public good. Such a strategy would send a strong signal for integration. A common management of borders would strengthen confidence and avoid even the suspect of opportunistic behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, the Brexit vote has increased policy uncertainty, especially over the medium term. Strategic decisions are being considered by market participants in the expectation that the redefinition of the UK-EU relationship will impact on costs and benefits of long-term investment and relocation. In continental Europe, a sequence of election and referendum events could, in some cases, lead to outcomes that would question basic choices about the EU and Euro area membership. The alternative, to remain in Europe, is not by itself sufficient to reduce policy uncertainty by a significant amount. The real alternative requires accelerating the process of integration so as to deliver to EU citizens a credible promise that Europe is the solution in terms of jobs, welfare, security, and inclusion, rather than being part of the problem. More integration is needed both at the Euro area and the European Union levels. It is a complex task which requires many components. I am convinced that in several of such components, Germany and Italy share a common view. Thank you for your attention.